We are really happy to welcome back Govind Nair. He spoke last winter. We always worry about him getting here because they come from far away. So Govind and Marcella came back up from Washington to be here. Govind Nair is, he spent 25 years in global development research, project management, and capacity building, the World Bank. But he retired, but once I go on, you'll see he's not really retired. He set up an independent practice as an international consultant, trainer, and public speaker. He's led workshops and conferences around the world on business and policy issues related to globalization and aimed at senior leaders in government, the private sector, and civil society. A lifelong humanist and dual USA and Australian national. That's interesting, I didn't know that. He's lived in 6 countries and traveled to 90, so he's truly a man of the world. He was a board member of the Northern Virginia Ethical Society, and has also been active in humanist organizations outside the USA. He currently divides his time between his home he and Marcella, between Washington, D.C. area and Cambridge in the UK, where I happen to know his daughter lives. In Washington, he is actually teaching a graduate course in managerial economics at George Washington University. So before you glaze over, I'm going to turn the podium over to Govind Nair. Please welcome him.
Wow, thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I feel like I've just refreshed my cup of coffee after 1 year because there's so many familiar faces around here. And some new ones. And let me first say thank you. Thank you for allowing me to continue our chat and to present to you what is my ongoing work in progress on humanism and globalization. That was my topic last year. It doesn't matter if you were here last year or if you're drawing a blank about what I said last year, if you were here, because I was going through the same thing last night, trying to pick up those threads, because that actually establishes a fundamental point about what I'm going to talk about today. And that is, we are creatures of very limited social bandwidth. Now, I'm not casting aspersion on a lot of our faculties, but here's an important point based on sociological research, and specifically something called the Dunbar number, named after the sociologist who came up with it. And it says that we are capable only of maintaining an active social circle of, on average, 150 friends. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about indigenous societies who haven't left their habitats for centuries, or the modern denizens of the internet like ourselves, who have a number of friends. There's a little bit of variance around that, but it's a pretty robust research conclusion. And it's quite relevant to our discussion today, and I'm going to come back to it in a moment. Because today, what I'd like to talk about are a set of historical, I won't call them problems, I'm going to call them issues. But they are issues of a speed of change, of a scale and scope that no previous generations in the history of our species have encountered. And one of the reasons is that these are issues that are truly and inescapably global in scope. And they go beyond any circle of 150 or so friends that we can have. And they cannot be left to professionals who deal with these issues every day, because they have to involve us as citizens who need to act upon these issues. In a few words, what I'm going to talk about is, number 1, climate change, number 2, population, number 3, artificial intelligence. And I'll say more about this in a moment. Now, I could add many more problems if you want. I think we've got enough to chew on for the next half hour. Here's the point. The reason we're going to talk about these problems, as I said, is because we need to be engaged in them. They're too important to be said that, well, it's all about 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 2 decades from now. This is the future that we are now living, and it's very crucial for us to go beyond our limited social bandwidth and deal with them. Now, this morning, I'm going to strip away a lot of the data and charts and peer-reviewed publications I normally cite. I'm going to leave them in my thumb drive. If any of you are interested, because a lot of what I'm saying is actually based on research, I'm happy to share the sources of all of this with you. But I don't want us to lose sight of the forest from the trees. And by the way, we plant trees. So we think about the future. My concern here is about choices that we have about the future. And we can understand this better if we just briefly look at how we have journeyed to this point in our history from our ancient past. Because we were once a very feeble species. We stood 80,000 years or more ago on the plains of Africa, and we know now that's correct because we now use genomics. We don't use bones anymore to determine that. We were at that time vulnerable to all kinds of predation and competition. Gorillas, chimpanzees, and other great apes, other great ancestors of ours, could easily tear any one of us apart within a matter of minutes. Today, we face a different fate as a species after successfully migrating out of Africa and occupying every landmass on this planet. Today, we harness our hydrosphere, our atmosphere, and our biosphere, and in that tiny span of time relative to the Earth's history, the tiny span of less than 3 lifetimes since the second half of the 19th century, our rates of extracting resources, of diverting water, of affecting the atmospheric composition of our planet, and impacting our species, our rate of doing that just in the span of 3 lifetimes now rivals what took other geological eras millions of years. And so this is why some people say we've entered the age of the Anthropocene, the age where human beings actually affect the geological history of our planet. And with the speed with which we have changed our status on this planet, we no longer fear other great apes, other predators or competitors as we did when we stood on the plains and highlands of Africa 100,000 years ago. Instead, today, we are using facial recognition technology to save primates from human traffickers. And we do so, and this speaks to 2 hallmarks of our species, because we have developed 2 critical faculties, which I also believe are the 2 pillars of humanism. These 2 faculties are, we can call one of them our mind, which abstracts, which models, which experiments, and innovates, and through which we develop what we call our scientific and technological culture. The second faculty is what we might call heart, and this is through which we develop rules, we develop norms, laws, and institutions which allow us to cooperate, whether it's within small, trusted networks or across large networks with which we exchange ideas and goods across the planet, which is how we have developed this scientific and technological culture. Now, my goal today is to explore with you how and whether we can, with heart and mind, confront the kinds of new problems we face as a globalized species, with issues and choices vastly different from what previous human generations have confronted. We have yet to fully demonstrate that our mind and heart are prepared for these challenges, although I believe there is evidence that we have begun. And I will say already that I'm a cautious optimist here. Now, how many of you disagree that climate change represents an existential challenge in the near future? I don't see any. Okay, one dissenter. Okay, that's very good. The question is, do you disagree? All right, let's move it from the negative. Do you agree that climate change potentially represents an existential challenge for the future. Okay, wow. So it could be that the polar vortex we just experienced has chilled any doubts, any remaining doubts. Okay, all right, I am confusing weather and climate, I know that, and climate scientists generally like to distinguish the two because they are very different concepts. Climate change is about the change, the long-run change, or the trend in change in average temperature, whether we measure that in the atmosphere, on land, or at sea, and weather is what we see happening in our backyard. But it is interesting, and as I look back over the last 2 decades, I find that climate scientists are more and more ready, or less and less cautious about linking climate change and weather patterns. And why? Because the 20 warmest years on record, as we've heard frequently, have all been in the past 22 years, with 2015 to 2018 making up the top 4. And our polar vortex here on the East Coast and Midwest comes at a time when Australia, which is my second home, has been experiencing record average summer temperatures, 20 degrees Fahrenheit higher than normal, and that is an average of 105 degrees across the Australian landmass. And every week, when I speak to my sister in Australia, she tells me new things. Roads are melting in Australia, including the highway between Sydney and Melbourne. 1/3 of a single species, the flying fox bat, has, in the space of 72 hours, been wiped out by 30% in 72 hours. They have literally been boiling, while in our northern hemisphere we are shivering. We have been shivering in our polar vortex. And this is the point. We share one planetary energy system, one atmosphere. So it is highly probable that weather patterns across the world are actually related. Now, some of you may have a passion for listening to weather reports from all over the world. I only started doing that 2 summers ago. And I did that when we were experiencing Hurricane Harvey. And what I did is I scoured Google to look at weather reports in different regions of the world. And what did I find out? At the same time, about the same time we were experiencing Hurricane Harvey, there was extreme heat in Europe. There was record heavy rainfall in Mumbai, India, which crippled transport and infrastructure in a city of about 20 million, killing over 2 dozen. There was unprecedented drought in the Horn of Africa, creating a major food crisis. And in South America, over the previous 3 months in Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, hundreds of people were killed, thousands were displaced in floods and mudslides due to unusual torrential rains. And so it is interesting, whenever we experience unusual weather patterns here, it's an interesting question now. Check out what's happening in the rest of the world. I think when we look at these events in retrospect, now 2 years later, we look at what happened in 2017, people are saying, yes, there were climate change factors which underpinned all of these patterns. Now, 8 years ago, I was a speaker on climate change at a regional conference of academics on real estate management in the Asia-Pacific region. And this is the part of the world which faces perhaps the greatest threat to climate change catastrophe in coming decades along the heavily populated coastal regions all the way from Japan through China, through the archipelagos of the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, and these fragile Pacific islands, and all of whose coastal cities I've visited, and I've actually seen some of these threats up close. And I remember speaking at this conference this was in 2011, against a backdrop of historic floods which impacted 200,000 people in Queensland, killed 35 of them, and wreaked over $2.2 billion in damage, Australian dollars. And before I stood up to speak, I remember my fellow speaker leaning over to me and whispering to me, "So are you going to scare us now?" And I thought about this for a moment, and I said, you know, I'd be really scared if I really thought we couldn't do anything about this. And that's actually the same way I feel today. We know that these GHG emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are correlated with average temperature rises over the last 6 or 7 decades where we have clear data. And we have choices to make. We can mitigate, perhaps even stabilize, maybe even reverse this trend of rising greenhouse gas emissions. And I say this despite the latest warnings of the last October 2018 assessment of the United Nations panel of climate scientists from the entire world, and they reviewed about 6,000 peer-reviewed scientific citations. And this latest report shrinks our window of action from what I remember being projected in 2011 as 3 more decades to what is now only 10 years. We only have about 10 years left to reverse trends so that we don't cross certain thresholds, 1.5 or 2 degree average rise in temperature. But however alarmed we can and should be, this point remains. We still have that window to act. And we have the reason and agency as a species because we have come a long way since we were that feeble species who stood on the Ethiopian highlands 70,000 years ago to occupy the entire planet. So the question becomes, when will we start acting? Now, I'm not going to dwell further on climate change. We have a lot of ground to cover because there are other issues at stake that are related to this. But I do hope that latecomers like myself will continue watching local weather reports from around the world. Next hurricane season, or the next time a hard winter is upon us. Now, I want to relate these scenarios of climate change, modeling climate change, to something else that's happening in our future. And this is world population dynamics. Because today, we are also witnessing a historic demographic transition never seen before. Never before in history have we seen more than 8 billion human beings on this planet who are now projected to have lifetimes averaging 60 to 85 years. Now, it was only about 4 generations ago in the early part of the 19th century that the average lifetime was still about between 30 and 40 years across the entire planet for a human population at that time which had just reached the first billion. Now, we can model all kinds of relationships between climate and population change using carbon intensity of our economy, our energy mix, our average resource use and consumption, and multiply all of this by the global population, which is expected to level off at around 10 billion by 2050, by which time India surpasses China as the most populous country on the planet, and Nigeria surpasses the United States. We are increasingly aware of what this implies in terms of resource use. We are actually doing things and we're changing our behaviors. Last month, the US Agriculture Department reported that canned tuna consumption has fallen by 40% per capita in the last 30 years. And in 2016, at least 37% of all Americans ate vegetarian meals at least some of the time. Such behavioral changes are not just happening at the individual level. We have professional investment groups representing about 6.5 trillion in managed assets, who are now calling on the world's 6 largest food companies to do more to address greenhouse gas emissions and water use in their animal agriculture industry. So yes, we are not being entirely passive, but the question still remains, is all of this enough given the scale, the speed, and the scope of the challenge? Now, aggregate population is only one set of population concerns. We must also make choices about how to adapt to changing economic power and geopolitical balance. We're all aging as individuals. Newsflash, don't need to remind us. But so are nations. Nations are also aging. But nations are aging at different rates. In the so-called industrial or developed world, Italy and Japan were the first countries to reach, about 2 decades ago, what we call sub-replacement fertility, which means fewer people being born to replace those who are dying, leading to a shrinking population. And there are today about 20 countries in this category of shrinking populations. But at the same time, we have other countries which are not aging as fast, but where instead the youth population right now is bulging, and where the working age population is still growing relative to the non-working age population. And this phenomenon, combined with trade and diffusion of technology, is shifting the locus of economic growth, metaphorically speaking, from north to south. That is, what we used to call developing or emerging countries, and that includes China and Russia, by some measures today command more than half of the world's economic output, and their share of total output is expected to grow. And these countries are going to dominate our consumption patterns. And it's also where new companies, not just people, are born, and where more and more of global research is going to be completed. They're going to play a very important role in determining our future. All of this implies geopolitical shifts for which we also need to be prepared And it's not as if, as some would have it, a story about the decline of the United States as a superpower. It is instead a story about how new economic and possibly military powers like China are catching up. So it's more a catching up story than a decline story. So in relative terms, we're likely to see new countries stand by many measures as co-equals to the United States within 2 decades or less. And China and India in particular will be poised to reclaim, after 3 centuries, their status historically as the 2 largest economies in the world. How will we as an international community adjust to these new realities? Also, within countries, we are witnessing demographic change. In Europe, in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, where migration patterns have and continue to alter social composition. And what we saw in 2016 as backlash in the Brexit vote in the UK and our own 2016 elections here can now be explained by voter data. We have the data now to explain why did these things happen. Sadly, bigotry and xenophobia have now more explanatory power in these political outcomes than we would like to admit. Walls, physical or psychological, will do nothing to stop these inexorable trends. Unfolding population dynamics and migration patterns cannot be reversed. We need to ask ourselves how we can harness the prospect of socioeconomic renewal from such changes instead of inviting the worst in our tribal selves born out of our small hunter-gatherer communities of yesteryear. Now, in some sense, demographic change is more predictable than any other change, even climate change. Here's one scenario to consider, if our models, in fact, are correct. What if we break that critical threshold, and I hope we don't, of 2 or 2.5 degree increase in average global temperatures? If that happens, we're likely to see a picture where, for example, a once desolate and seriously underpopulated region like Siberia will turn into a rich land for cereal cultivation. But at the same time, an overpopulated Africa, because Africa is the fastest growing area for population, will be largely unhospitable as tropical diseases such as malaria become prevalent even in high altitudes in the tropics. Will we then see a massive migration, as we once had seen when our species moved out of Africa 70,000 years ago? We are a migrating species. Or perhaps even from the neighboring provinces of China, which already have populations 10 or more times greater than Siberia. The important question is, will these changes occur with renewed and heightened worldwide conflict, or can they occur harmoniously? And what choices can we make today to reduce the likelihood of such conflict? Okay, another set of big questions. Now, let me finally turn, but very briefly, to the future impact of artificial intelligence. Literally dozens of well-researched studies have now modeled what tasks in present-day occupations can be done by robots and controlled by algorithms and artificial intelligence. The conclusions vary a little by location, but the overwhelming result is that within the next 10 years, 50 to 70% of all tasks currently done by human workers can be replaced by automation all over the world. And because the cost of production and computing will continue to fall precipitously, this conclusion is invariant to the cost of labor, which means that even so-called low-income areas such as China have started to worry, and they're now buying 40% of the world's robots every year. But with no answer yet about what to do with this potential of huge pools of displaced workers. Now, most of us do not see the warehouses and the back offices where this automation is already taking place at phenomenal speed. Nor are we usually aware of how much AI is already tracking us every day, for example, in our shopping mall. So here's a quick list of what's happening, or what you might want to be aware is happening the next time you go to your favorite clothing store in a shopping mall. Thermal imaging technology are determining patterns of your customer movement through space, showing areas of dense movement versus sparse movement. Device-based tracking keys into your mobile device, unique identifier, are tracking your individual consumer behavior in retail space. Computer vision is already monitoring which specific items are being removed from the shelves by consumers like ourselves and which are being put back. Wi-Fi, just by simply logging in, is sharing your unique media access control address with the provider, and you when you use a social login and your personal information, these are also being captured. Floor sensors are measuring our foot path and engagement through the shopping areas by location. Apps such as mobile payment software geographically and temporally identify us and our body patterns. Radio frequency identification transmitters attached to products are detecting our movement. I could add more. This is not all conjecture. I got this list from a global fashion magazine article published yesterday. It wasn't even a technology magazine. So we tend to link AI or think of AI as displacing labor automation, and we tend to think of this as the stuff of dystopian science fiction and with plots driven by robot enslavement of humans. Okay? But the real choices that we face are likely to be more subtle, but no less insidious. And for the civil libertarians among ourselves who used to worry about what the governments know about our past, I think our real worry now has to be what a handful of corporations already know about our futures. Because with the volume of data available about our individual behaviors exploding, predictive analytics driven by algorithms can actually determine with 99% or more accuracy where we're going to be tomorrow, what we're going to buy, how we're going to behave, where we're going to travel. All of this is actually available right now. And that accuracy, and this also extends to things like diagnostics and so on. It's not necessarily just a malign thing. But this information, these data, are concentrated in the hands of a few. And we know who they are. You know, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Amazon, Baidu in China, a number of telecoms companies. How should we control or should we allow such a concentration of data and such a concentration of power? How do we confront our growing vulnerabilities as our infrastructure and even our life systems become susceptible to disruptive attacks, which could emanate from any part of this interconnected world that we are building? Okay, it's Sunday morning. I do not intend to be apocalyptic. I actually intend to be quite the opposite. The question for all of us is this: can our limited social bandwidth deal with questions of this scale and speed and scope? If you are like me, you probably wake up on a Saturday or Sunday morning not thinking about these issues, but you're thinking about, well, mom's visit to the neurologist this morning and a conversation about whether we should be placing her in a home. Or my conversation this afternoon with my daughter or my son when they come back home and we're going to talk about college boards and admissions. Or maybe a conversation with my broker. Should I move from moderately aggressive to conservative? And my neighbor comes over. Should I step down from the homeowners association board? And my conversation with my classmate. Maybe I should participate in the committee for that college reunion. We keep our transactions largely within this bandwidth of 150 people whom we interact with. But yet, at the same time that we're doing that, we have this unique power, each one of us, for the first time in history, to be our own radio station, our own TV station, our own publisher. No generation in history has wielded that kind of power we now have as individuals to network, to share ideas, to share strategies, and to act in concert. And no generation has faced the kinds of civilizational and existential issues that we confront on a global scale. So I think it's time for us to ask, is it game on or is it game over? If it's game on, then we should begin to be using the best of our gifts of observation, of modeling, of experimentation, and of compassion and cooperation to start building new networks across nation states, across cities. These things are possible, and my next episode, if I get the chance to talk to you about it, is what's happening in social network theory and what we can do about that. That, I believe, would give us a chance of bringing out the best in ourselves. And that would give us a chance, I think, of looking ahead and seeing that probably our best days are yet still ahead of us, and we're not facing these calamities that we rightfully worry about. But if it's game over, then we are akin to being self-proclaimed fatalist victims of our own poverty of imagination. We would use correctly our science and reason to model the future and to rightly proclaim with certainty that the last day on our planet is 5 billion years from now. That is correct. We are modeling, for example, how the sun is consuming its fuel, and we know a point at which that would occur. And we would rightly conclude that our dying sun will expand into a red giant, consume all our atmosphere, engulf our planet. But we would wrongly then infer from this, if it's game over, the nihilistic conclusion that nothing matters, whether with respect to our grandchildren, or our taxes due on April 15th. Nothing matters. I don't think this is how we really behave. I think we really behave as if it's game on. And I think we need to seize the consciousness of what we already know about these problems, what we already know about ourselves and how to organize ourselves, and what we have as this new social technology. And as we engage with it, we're going to learn even more, because there's going to be a lot more knowledge and learning and technology for us to deal with. I do not seek to be Pollyannish, but I choose to believe we have the power to mobilize ourselves in unique ways and go well beyond this social bandwidth that has come to us as a legacy. How exactly we do this? Well, that may be a topic of another presentation, a future presentation, so let's just see this as a warm-up. Now, if you have the feeling that I've left you with more questions than answers this morning, I won't apologize, because I want to conclude with a reminder of who we are, both as thinking beings, but also as willful agents. In other words, we have mind and we have agency, and that's what humanism is about. And those of you who were here last year to hear my first presentation will now hear the echo of my closing quote, and it is from the Austrian neurologist and psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, who said this: "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom." Thank you for letting me talk to you.
It's you were born in Australia, right? Oh, in Singapore. Yeah, well, I was going to ask you to join the army of people standing for the Democratic nomination for president, because probably when you come back, and you will come back to give us the next episode, the answers to all of these questions. Thank you very much. That was really wonderful. We have an opportunity now to have you. I've already given you my reflection. What about you? What did this talk make you think about? Anyone want to sort of contribute, or?
So, really, wow, what can I almost feel like, what can I say? But it seems to me there's a through line between the three topics, and that is how these issues intersect with the global economics and the system we are all living under. You know, all 7.5 or 8 billion of us are really living under capitalism, and how it doesn't really help us to address the problems of climate change, that's for sure. But also, all of these issues are reflected through a lens of that, for example, in climate change, there isn't much discussion outside of, environmental groups and socialists and all, those people, right, of who's going to take responsibility and who's going to pay. And right now, it looks like the people who didn't cause the problem, really, are going to pay the most. And I suspect artificial intelligence will, that will unfold in the same way. It'll be used to control people of the global south and those, like the populations in the United States and Western Europe, et cetera, of those people, right? So how can we turn that around? That's my question.
Govind, if you'd like to respond.
Didn't you pick it up next?
No, I'll take the next, but I will respond. I will respond, yes.
Oh, it always seems to me that there's a minority of people control so many of the problems we have, like global warming, like gun control. It's always like a small minority dictate, and really the majority of people in this country want gun control. There's a small minority of people who control and dictate what gets on the news. And it's very frustrating because even global warming, the majority of people believe it, yet we do nothing about it because there's a bunch of yahoos, small minority, who control the power and don't want to change. And that's very frustrating. And how do you, stop this,
Unfortunately, it is our capitalism that's a large accelerator of global warming. If I'm not mistaken, the leading cause of global warming is secondary to combustible gases related to automobile travel and air travel. We're doing it ourselves with our ability to use gas. We're polluting the environment. Maybe somebody could teach our hires up about the truth of science and what's actually happening, and maybe we could use some social pressure and embarrassment to teach our leaders, hey jerk, wake up, these are the facts. In any case, in order to use our technology to a good advantage, there is such a thing as clean energy. And there's a huge market for wind power, which is giving us a lot of energy, and electrical energy and nuclear energy, which rings up a lot of emotional bells with people, but it does provide a significant amount of energy. And maybe we could use our capitalist interests in developing these multiple forms of clean energy. And maybe with time and with open-mindedness, maybe people will learn that there are better ways to take care of our environment. Maybe with this additional time, people will learn that this is indeed an emergency, and let's work harder to avoid the gas and the pollution and use other means with which to produce energy. And I know this is a subject for another talk, but the bottom line is, how can we spread the word globally to diffuse and enhance the knowledge and give everybody the impetus to strive further in protecting the planet. And I think we have to get people like Al Gore more press time to try to educate everybody.
Thank you. Professor Nair, I'm Satish Mehta. I'm very enthused and very excited about this presentation from you. You are a dynamic speaker, well put together, different thoughts, particularly on artificial intelligence, where you referred to enslavement of humans. Way back in the early 70s in India, where I was an engineer working there was a movement of data processing machines to be introduced in banks. And there were lakhs and lakhs of people on the streets across the different major cities in India protesting against that, saying it will take away our jobs. Where have we come from then till today? The computerization has become the way of life. And when you say better days are ahead of us, I completely believe in you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. There are many other things that appeal to me today. We'll chat.
Are you okay? What I think the biggest challenges is extremely religious people who believe that God will take care of us no matter what, and that the fate of the earth is essentially in God's hand, not in human hands. And I've yet to see anybody who can effectively talk to somebody with reason, who confuses reason and intellectual conversations with beliefs. And I wonder how you address people in those circumstances.
Okay.
Many years ago, when Reagan was our president, family planning was being spread all over the world. The U.S. was supporting it, and population was getting controlled in many countries. I don't know how many, and I don't know if that's going on at all now, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Okay.
In that space between synapse and response, do we have to change the way we approach situations?
And on the clock, that's about all the input we have time for. So
All right. Okay. I'm not sure I'll be able to respond to everything, but let me kind of put it in 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4, for me 5 buckets. Capitalism versus the market. The fate of liberal democracy, number 2. Renewable energy, the economics of renewable energy, and maybe what's the relationship between truth and ethics and the place of religion. Okay, that's how I'm kind of deconstruct everything that's being said here. Okay, so capitalism and the marketplace are not the same thing. I speak as an economist here. I think the marketplace is a very powerful mechanism that we need to use to coordinate society. Where I think we've gone wrong is we have been for quite a while, for several decades now, in a place where we are rewarding capital more than labor. And what do I mean by that? All the progress that we make, the productivity gains that we achieve through our technology, are disproportionately now rewarding those people who hold assets rather than those people who earn a wage income. That's largely coming from our taxation system. You see this in the United States, you see this in other countries, but it's also partly coming from our regulatory systems. These are things we can change. We can actually change them, and we can use the marketplace to change them, because taxes will affect prices, carbon taxes will affect the use of fossil fuels. In fact, if you look at the real cost of renewables today, the cost curves have now crossed. In other words, the real economic price of solar energy, wind energy, and geothermal is actually now lower than fossil fuels. But we are living in a distorted economy where our system of taxes and subsidies, are still skewing our choices. So these are all things we can do. How can we do this? We need to save something that we took a few hundred years to build, called liberal democracy. This is not just, it may have originated in what we call the West, but I think this is a legacy that we have to protect because it is under threat. And liberal democracy is a mechanism through which we give voice to ourselves. We give voice to our majority. We are failing in that. However, I don't think it's an entirely lost cause. When you have 5 million people on January the 21st of 2016 in 500 demonstrations across the world, voice what they're feeling, and have that actually cascade into election choices. This is a sign that voice can still have a place. And I do believe that we have the technology to remind all of ourselves about what we have to do. This can actually tell us every second how we reduce our carbon footprint with any choice. When you step into a restaurant, when you decide to take a car, a train, a bus, or walk to a place and so on, when you decide to remodel your house or what house you want to live, we can actually develop apps and technologies, we have all of them right now, which can inform us about the carbon footprint consequences of any action we have. We can share that, we can give ourselves badges, we can use peer pressure, we can create groups. There is a powerful social imagination that is available to us to change our collective action. I do believe we haven't exploited that yet. We still use Facebooks to send pictures of our meals and our travels. Great stuff. There's a lot more we can do with that. The question of, what's next? We talked about renewables. Okay, truth and ethics. I personally believe that there is a link between our understanding of what the world is and our beliefs about what the world should be. Now, it's a big philosophical debate. Can you link an is statement to an ought statement? I think we can now, because I think we have enough knowledge to break down the consequences of our action and then to explain to people what are the costs and benefits of different choices that we make. Now, it may take a lot of information, but once again, we have to use that intelligence that we have reproduced in artificial intelligence to provide us information about that. We can't be doing all these computations. We can be experts in every area, but we have now, already today, the technology that can provide us the information. What we now need to develop is the literacy to use those means to engage in a collective dialogue among ourselves. And that is a new set of skills we have yet to learn. And in doing so, and I talked about this last year, one of the things that we have to understand is that we have a very bounded rationality. And by that I mean, not that there are limits to our knowledge, but that we suffer from all kinds of cognitive biases. And research shows that we tend to imagine that the future is going to look very much like the past. We tend to select data that confirms our prejudices rather than disconfirms them, and on and on. We have to learn about that. And we have to also learn about how we use these devices. Because only then, I think, we can achieve this real 21st century dialogue where we use the gift gift of science and so on, to engage with others, and to sort of illustrate these are the real consequences of our choices, the economic consequences, the social consequences, and the health consequences, and so on. This is why I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist in the sense that we have created the technologies already today. We haven't yet translated those technologies into capacity, into social capacity. There are probably a few things I haven't answered yet, but I am preparing a series of 5. There are 5 in this series. This is the first time I'm talking about this. The next one is about networks and how we are actually creatures of networks and not individual behavior. We can revisit some of these issues then. We're also doing a workshop in May. Again, I'm delighted to have had this dialogue with you, and I hope it's the beginning of something, not the end.